really very honored to have Anthony Appiah with us, who is come from America, as well as, well, we have so many good friends for this session. And Kenneth Munson has stepped in very nobly from Wisconsin, where it's almost the middle of the night. So he's very boldly got up very, very, very early for us, and we're honored to have him. And Dhouha Djerbi is with us, and we're honored to have her. But we turn over first of all to a very good friend of mine, Paul Gutteridge, the National Director of Initiatives of Change in the United Kingdom. And that's an organization I've known for some years because my late father was very involved with Initiatives of Change. But Paul is a new National Director, and he's certainly been pushing it in a new direction here in the United Kingdom as an organization. He's also just been made an Honorary Fellow of the Edward Cadbury Centre at Birmingham University, so our congratulations to him for that. And Paul will give us a few opening thoughts to start us off. Paul, over to you.
I thank you so much to William, Veronica and the NCF team for inviting me. The reason why I got ahead in life was because I was white. The Black Lives Matter conversation and the situation we're seeing right now is actually a white problem. I want to suggest to you it's a white problem. It is not a black problem. It is a white problem. And we are seeing we need to consider that the Black Lives Matter movement is happening within a broader context in the present day. And that broader context goes into the unconscious bias of the society we live in, and the conscious bias, which is frightening in and of itself. It comes into a setting where there's white privilege, there's white supremacy, white power. And I want to suggest that as we start to pick through the issues, that we don't operate from a place of abstraction, that we operate from a place of reality. So I'm going to suggest some things we can practically do. And I want to say as well, if we stand for nothing, we will fall for anything in this. And we need to have it thought through what actually is taking place in our society and what has led to this position. The movement that I'm part of leading, Initiatives of Change, it operates by 4 standards. And one of those standards is absolute honesty. And absolute honesty in this situation is not just saying, well, I think that what's happening is wrong, I don't like it, let's see a change. Absolute honesty is far more penetrating for us as a society. Absolute honesty is not just saying, hey, this is difficult, we need to face up to this, let's do it. There is a history of hundreds of years that have led us from there to here. Not in the abstract, but in reality, certain things that have been done, certain systems that are in place, because ultimately we're dealing with both systems and hearts. And because we're dealing with systems and hearts, we are, from a systemic point of view, we need a 30-year vision that looks at 2 or 3 generations of dealing with things to the point where we address and redress the balance. It's about hearts because ultimately it takes individuals who are changed to make decisions that operate within the system or speaking into the system. Now, those things may seem quite abstract, but the reality is that is how things change. It's people like myself, people like yourselves, that actually honestly have an account of what's happened that's led us from there to here, and then how that plays into the systems. And I've got 3 ways that we can do that. But just before we move in, I just want to give some thoughts that are happening in terms of the far right, in terms of how they are going to and how they are actively seeking to take advantage of what is happening in Black Lives Matters at the moment. And what we're seeing is a call not just for integration into society now, but we are now seeing a call from the far right into assimilation. And that's different because integration allows us to retain and celebrate our distinctives, whatever colour or culture or creed we may have, in a peaceful manner. Assimilation means that those things are marginalised so that people become part of the homogenous mass. And in our culture, that's about whiteness, whatever that means. And there's a hijacking of all sorts of language. There's a hijacking. This is not the conversation for the far right, but there's a hijacking of these things that are being taken advantage of because of what we're seeing in the media and what we're seeing literally on the ground with the Black Lives Matter. So you've got this coming in as well. And that's why it's a white issue, because we cannot stand for nothing. We need to stand for something. So we need a vision. We need a vision for our systems. We need a vision for our own conscious and unconscious bias. And we need to feel the responsibility and pain of that, I suggest, in order to move us from A to B to the vision we want to see. Now, we need to start with a right mindset, that we understand that it's about systems and hearts. We need to understand, I suggest, that it's a multi-generational approach. There's an investment that's needed now, but we need to be thinking 30 years ahead, because this is a systemic issue. And also, there's two things I want to bring to the table. When I speak to people, I'm off next week to speak to some people, I'm speaking to individuals in the inner cities of different parts of the country in the UK. I will have white guys and black guys saying, we don't think that Black Lives Matter is an issue. And I'm like, what? No, it's not an issue. Poverty is the issue, because they say that they believe there's a conspiracy. Even some of my black friends in those communities, it's a conspiracy. Black Lives Matter is just a convenient way to get us to fight each other and not deal with poverty. I don't actually think, and my other black friends as well, don't think that's the issue entirely. I think there are two issues. One is what we're seeing is we need racial justice because there's racial injustice. And number two, we are seeing the need for social justice because there's social injustice. Now, the reason why those two things are important for us to bear in mind is that social injustice also includes racial injustice as well. So it's not just the fact that my friend is black in that community and experiences racial injustice. Is he's black in that community and experiences both racial and social injustice. My white friend, because I used to live in those communities, they experience social injustice, but they don't experience racial injustice. So my black friends get a double whammy. And that's why this is really important to pick through as we think about how we respond to Black Lives Matter. We need both racial justice and social justice. But let's not kid ourselves into thinking it's just about poverty and social justice. There is this element here that I don't experience as a white guy coming from that very same community. And that's important for us to start to think about as we look for concrete solutions to what we are experiencing. I want to share 3 simple steps. I'm mindful of time. I want to share 3 simple steps. Number one, I believe that in order for us to begin to have an effective strategy for dealing with the issues, I think it's a white issue. I think that Black Lives Matter, we are totally against racism. But in order to deal with that, how would we do things? I think number one, as I've alluded to, we need this sense of absolute radical honesty. How did we get here from there? That doesn't just apply to the UK and Europe and the US. That applies to people in all cultures, places and times. How did I get money? How did the white guy, how did we as an institution get that money, get that power, get that influence? And we need to tell the story. My black friends are saying, don't tear down the statues. Put a plaque in front of the statues that tells the story of how these people got the money. Other black friends of mine are saying, tear down the statues, they're abhorrent. I come from Bristol, Edward Colston, the Colston Hall, a great philanthropist. But of course, my friends are saying, well, he is only giving money away that he already stole from marginalised people. So we need honesty in the conversation. Number two, I think we need to think about currency. Friends of mine are very senior officers in the police in the UK. Friends of mine are very senior people in institutions. And they are devastated by what's happening because they want to see a change. That you use this white skin and your privilege, use your position as currency. Spend yourself on something bigger and outside of yourself. My friends in senior positions in banks from the BAME community, they're saying, Paul, you can't get it right. It's going to be so difficult. And some of them are so nervous about what's happening. They're saying, we understand if white men and women put their head down at the moment because it is so frightening to address, because you're going to sound racist, you'll get things wrong. And I said to them, that is not a good enough excuse not to step out and make a difference. We need to spend ourselves in order to see something change. If it's something that's valuable, it carries currency. So I think we need to have a brutal honesty. I think we need to have a culture where we see whatever position we're in as currency that can be spent on a bigger vision. And finally, I think that the third thing that I think we need to think in terms of margins. My friends in politics, my friends who work in think tanks, I have a bit of a running joke with them and saying it's very comfortable for you to dream up policy from the middle. You're in a bubble. It's comfortable. You're in an institution. Whether you're white or BAME, you're still in a comfortable institution which ultimately has a self-serving bias. My suggestion is that as well as dreaming up policy from the centre to deal with this, we need to be dreaming up policy on the margins. In other words, who are those people in those places that can talk to the margins of our society that are really experiencing the pinch and the pain of both racial and the social injustice, and actually say what policies and what actual things need to take place there, and then backward engineer it to the centre so that there's a coming together so that it begins to work. And in terms of how we engage, I want to leave us with this. I think we need to become like midwives. My thing is that we need to midwife something. In other words, we need to be in the room, whether it's in the margins or the centre or the institutions, and actually be those people that stand in the place and bring those people and ideas together, not so that we get the credit, not so that we get the glory, but actually so that we can create safe enough environments for the specialists, the activists, the disillusioned, disenfranchised, the marginalised and the powerful to have access to each other, to have the kinds of conversations and dialogue that will output genuine changes that will create sustainable and quantifiable and qualified changes to the people whose lives are most affected. Because my fear is that we will have more of the same, which is an assuaging of guilt by saying we need to raise the debate, but then nothing changes. And I think we need to be honest, we need currency, and we need margins to speak in. And having said all that, this is not going to happen in our lifetime. But that doesn't mean that we don't spend our lives seeding something for the future. Because if we don't, we will. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. That's powerfully said and very, very helpful. We'll go for a moment now to Larry and just bring Larry in just for a few words on this subject before we open up to discussion. And yes, Larry, maybe you could just add a few words.
I also speak as a white privileged male who has been a priest for nearly 30 years in part of the global Anglican Church that has just set up a commission to investigate endemic racism within its structures and institutions. And I'm also a former police officer in Birmingham. As a Christian priest, I subscribe to a mandate of inclusive love, while in practice I wrestle with my own prejudices. I sense the fears and anxieties of many who feel overwhelmed and even besieged by current trends in society. Some respond with bewilderment, others with anger, others with an uncomfortable aversion or an awkward attempt at engagement. As a priest in one of the most ethnically diverse and dynamic cities in Britain, the fruits and blessings of multiculturalism are all around me. Birmingham has a good track record of racial harmony, but we mustn't be complacent. The immediacy of social media brings international incidents directly to our attention, and the killing of George Floyd resonated globally. The expressions of grief and outpourings of protest witnessed in America, the UK, and elsewhere have accelerated the need for comprehensive reassessment of our attitudes, our values, and even our history. From my perspective, there are two distinct, though interconnected, aspects to the upsurge of protests which are most challenging. Firstly, raising consciousness of the depth of racism still prevalent in our society. And secondly, the pressing need to reconsider accepted views of history. As a person of faith, I search the sacred texts of my religion for guidance and inspiration. In them I find challenge and hope, for they are both an historical witness to the struggles of faithful people, while containing truth and wisdom for future generations. A prophet revered by Jews, Christians and Muslims is known to me as Ezekiel. In the prophetic book of his writings that bear his name, is found a key chapter in chapter 18, as it's called in our Christian Bible. In this chapter, the prophet draws a profound distinction between the wrongdoings of parents and children, one generation and another, and who will bear the consequences of those wrongdoings. Previously, it was widely believed children were punished for the sins of their parents. God's anger would punish the many for the sins of the few. Ezekiel reforms this sense of collective punishment, so the sins of the previous generation are not to be regarded as the responsibility of the next. The current generation, says the prophet, must bear the consequences of its wrongdoing and sin. In the current campaigns for retrospective justice and recompense for the sins of previous generations who exploited, abused and enslaved millions, many of my generation and background acknowledge the legitimacy of these campaigns while sensing we are being perceived as complicit. The discomfort this generates becomes an obstacle to addressing current issues of racism, exploitation, abuse and slavery. Some of my generation and background ask ourselves, can we be sure that the pulling down of statues, violent and non-violent protests, the reform of historical narratives, national acts of remorse and, where possible, compensation awarded, will they help to address and overcome racism and exploitation in this generation? Or put another way, are these campaigns necessary preliminaries before a new Enlightenment era of racial justice can dawn? Our reservations are that while they may be powerful acts of protest and demolition, they appear nihilistic and as such are in danger of hardening attitudes among those we are seeking to transform attitudes. Finally, retrospective justice is important and necessary, but the victims of racism and exploitation now must take the highest priority. Let not the campaigns for the former detract from the urgency of the latter.
Thank you. We have 3 speakers, and you will all get a chance to listen to and hear them personally. Kenneth Munson, who is an outstanding man in many ways, outstanding because he's stepped in at the last minute. He's also head of community care in Wisconsin, and he's former director of the Fire and Police Commission, former assistant city attorney, former assistant district attorney in Milwaukee, and Dhouha Djerbi from Tunisia. From Tunisia originally. She's, of course, from France now, and she'll be talking about Black Lives Matter in the French context. And the third speaker is our closing speaker, Kwame Anthony Appiah, has stepped in to take the third breakout room. As many of you will know of him, he's professor of philosophy and law at New York University and subscribes to a philosophical doctrine called cosmopolitanism, I believe. But anyway, Kwame will tell you about that. Just one other little scene-setting piece of information. I would quite like to maybe call on Katya just to give us a few statistics, because I know statistics are boring, but whereas the black population of the United States of America is 13.2% of the population, Katya's just got the up-to-date prison statistics, and maybe that might be kind of relevant. Katya, do you want to just step in for a moment?
I've done quite a bit of research, and it says that of incarceration rates, 1 in 26 black males are in prison. So that means that they're disproportionately targeted by the police in the US, and that they are 5.1 times more likely to end up in prison than white people. And I'd also like to speak to the 3 strikes policy that's here in the US. So the variation of this law exists in about 28 states, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it's a mandatory 25 years to a life sentence for individuals who have 3 or more felonies. And those felonies can include anything from drugs, rape, assault, theft, kidnapping, or arson charges. But Stanford University did an investigation in this, and they say that over 45% of inmates currently in the US under the three strikes law, are African American. And so this also disproportionately affects the mentally ill and physically disabled defendants. And the ACLU has done quite a bit of research over the pros and cons of this 3 strikes policy. Obviously, benefits include taking criminals off the streets, but they found that it doesn't necessarily prevent crimes from happening, especially because most of these crimes are done in the heat of the moment and they're not premeditated, as the 3 strikes policy doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to commit their last crime in order to land in prison. And they found that it actually causes more violence because those who are on the edge of receiving their 3rd charge tend to resist more against police because they have really nothing to lose. So I just thought this would be an interesting aspect to bring into the conversation.
And just to add a little point, in case we think that this is a uniquely American problem, in the United Kingdom, we also have a problem. Obviously, as you may or may not know, black children are 4 times, black children at, and then this is in primary schools, are 4 times more likely to be excluded from school than white children in the United Kingdom. And, for example, black males are 3.5 times more likely to be tasered than white males in the United Kingdom. So, and if you, just to take it one more stage further, all our universities have an excellent record for the inclusion of black students, with the exception of 2. There are only 2 universities in Britain that have an abysmal record for the inclusion of black students. They have a great record for the inclusion of ethnic minority students, Asian students, but not for black students. And those 2 universities are the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge, who are so far behind the other universities in Britain that it is extraordinary. And they are the 2 universities that produce 90% of Britain's members of Parliament. So Oxford and Cambridge are abysmally bad. So it's interesting that this is not a uniquely American problem, institutionalized disadvantage for the black community.
But also had very, very disturbing suggestion.
Yeah.
When I hear something about a 30-year plan for the future, this is an Orwellian reconfiguration of culture. When I hear the expression far right, it's difficult to define what it is. I mean, that's what the BBC and the Guardian and Channel 4 have been labeling everyone who voted Leave, for example, and so on. So, or because of the Oxbridge not taking black students, are we going to lower the standard for quota or suggest scholarships for secondary schools so deprived children, especially black children, can actually get a better marking and better grades to go to Oxbridge. If we hear the prisons are disproportionately black young men or black men, I just heard that the conclusion is because police targeting them rather than because of social conditions, making them more crime and so on. So I'm afraid, are we talking about healing? Or are we talking about sort of making the white majority feel guilty and then rewriting a culture and taking down the studios and another 1984 for the next 30 years?
Just my immediate reaction to your thought, Adel, is there's a difference between the historical situation and the current situation, and both must be addressed. But it is easy to just talk about historical issues, and we can never, if you're talking about justice, we can never provide justice for historical issues like slavery. I mean, the victims, how could you ever provide justice? There is no way. But with the current situation, with what's going on now, we can provide justice. And you're right, if we're going to lower the standards of education at Oxford and Cambridge, but it is surprising that Oxford and Cambridge uniquely in Britain have low levels of inclusion for black students, whereas other universities do not. That includes the great London universities, LSE, SOAS, and so on. And I'm not talking about foreign students, I'm talking about British students. The great London universities, they all have certainly reasonably high level of inclusion for black students. Only Oxford and Cambridge in Britain have low levels. So there is a question, I think, to be addressed.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
There's a little girl who's said, what can I do about it? And she said, I'm going to stand up and say there's nothing for little black girls. I don't want her to be a little black girl, but I am a little black girl, and there's nothing for little black girls. And she's looking for a newspaper, and I'm a little black girl, and I wasn't born. I was born black, and I have to remain black, and that's what she said. And I thought it was very powerful for her.
Paul,
I'll quickly say something
yes.
too with that. In terms of the Orwellian future, I think any vision that is compelling is open to scrutiny and pushback for sure. But let's actually have a vision. Secondarily, as a white person, I don't feel guilty. I feel privileged. And I want that privilege to be experienced by everybody in the society that I live in the same way that I'm proud to pay taxes because I want to see people flourish. It's part of a functioning, flourishing society. So for me, it's not about guilt, it's about privilege. It's the complete opposite. It's about opportunity. It's about a better future and a better hope and a better life. It's not about reducing standards. It's about empowering people to experience those standards, and I think that's very, very exciting. But then I like to flip things on their heads anyway.
I just wanted to add to Paul's comment. I think, if the experience of white guilt is uncomfortable, how is that comparable to the 100 years worth of history we're discussing? And I agree on the point of standards, that actually understanding social context, we've spoken about racial and social injustice, that has to be the lens at which we view things. And I suppose on the point of privilege, is it because we've experienced, white people, because we've experienced a better life by a product of our kind of, random genetic output, is it really privileged that we were treated well? That should be the norm. So I think white privilege, white guilt, white fragility, white exceptionalism are things we're just going to have to get very, very comfortable with in our 30-year vision.
Thank you. We've got Anthony. What a privilege. I haven't seen Anthony for many years, and it really is a joy to be with you first and foremost. Anthony, thank you so much for doing this at short notice. It's really heroic.
It's very lovely to see you again.
It is lovely to see you again. And we're in a room with Michael Macy and Paul Gutteridge and Larry Wright, so we'll turn over to Anthony. Anthony.
Let me just say, I live in the United States, though I grew up between England and Ghana, where my father was from. My mother was English. let me just talk a little bit about this country, because I think it's right, as both Paul and Larry said, that we one of the things we need to do is to get the history clear. And of course, part of the thing about talking about these questions in the North Atlantic context is that the histories are slightly different in different places. And so, for example, the United States, unlike Western Europe and Britain, is a place which it's very hard to think of as being, as it were, white forever, because we are conscious of ourselves mostly as a society created by mid-millennium migration, the settlement by Europeans and in the 17th century. I mean, started a bit earlier, but the big changes happened in the 17th century. And of course, that's the point at which, for the first time in 1619, enslaved black people were also brought to what is now the United States, to the colonies. And so that our first sin, the founding sin of the American, of our North American world, is of course the way that we treated the American Indian population, sometimes called Native Americans, but I think mostly they prefer to be called Indians, so that's what I'm going to call them. And so, and why is this important? Well, because in Europe, I think it's natural to think of Europe as it were having been white all along, going back as far as anybody knows, and therefore to think of non-white people as somehow present as both a relatively recent thing and also as a kind of, as it were, gesture of inclusion, so that the white people can think of black people as having been kindly invited in, as it were, into what's in some sense a white space. Whereas I say, in this country, while there are lots of white supremacists and while there are lots of people who think of the United States as white, the natural way to think about the United States is a place where people came from lots of places. And so nobody, as it were, except the Indians, owns the soil. Nobody's autochthonous. Nobody came out of the ground here, as we say in Asante, where I grew up. So I think that makes a difference. And the second big difference is that while European societies were responsible for the slave trade, European slavery was relatively small scale black slavery. Of course, there was much ancient slavery in Europe, and the reason we have the word slaves is because Slavs were enslaved, for example. But in terms of this modern form of racial injustice, the main contribution of Europe wasn't so much in terms of enslaving people in Europe. It was creating the slave trade and enslaving people in European colonies, in the Caribbean and North America and in Latin America. So that's also an important kind of historical difference. The founding, one of the founding sins of the United States, that is to say, the American Republic, it was founded starting with the revolution in 1776, was that it was a slave state, a slave constitution. Whereas that was never the case, for example, in Britain. Black slavery in Britain was not very common, and I mean in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And to the extent that there was some slavery, it essentially ceased pretty early on because it was decided by British courts and Scottish courts that slavery was violated the principles of British and Scottish legal tradition. So that's a very important difference, I think. And I speak as someone who's obviously not white, but who nevertheless has, at least going back to the 11th century, British ancestors. I know the name of Sir Guillaume de Crisp, who was my 17th great-grandfather and lived in Gloucestershire. But because I'm not white, it's very hard for people to think of me as it were, belonging in the same way as people with white skins do. And I think that, as I say, that's not the problem in the United States. Since the American Civil War and the constitutional amendments after the Civil War, there's no doubt about the full full legal citizenship and equality of black people. The problem is that we didn't live up to those promises. The problem, it's not that we didn't make them. So I think in terms of the history, that's an important contrast. Another big contrast is that Larry mentioned that he was a policeman earlier. There's a big difference between American policing and British policing, which is that the American police kill huge numbers of people every year, which is not a feature, luckily, of Britain. And one of the things that I think has made people think about George Floyd in this particular way is that he. Let me give you some statistics. 1 in 1,000 African American men is going to be shot to death or killed otherwise by police action. Not always, and some of those people are being killed by police officers acting in self-defense. I'm not saying that all of them are, killed in the way George Floyd was, but still, that's an awful lot of people. And worse than that, perhaps, is the fact that in a typical year, 1,000 Americans are shot to death by the police, and only a quarter of them are going to be black. So lots and lots of people are shot to death in this country. And in a way, the violence of in our society against black people is a typical instance of something that's true about black people generally in the United States, which is that they're kind of canaries in the coal mine. Many of the big problems of the United States are worse for black people, but they're bad for lots of people. It may be that 2.5 times as many per capita African Americans are shot, but that still means that more white people are shot than black people in this country because there's so many more white people than black people to shoot. And the same is true, for example, of the massive problems of disparity in healthcare between African American populations and the general population. The problems which we've seen in the pandemic, where death rates for African Americans have been, actually for people of color generally, been higher than for the average person population. Again, that's terrible, but our death rates have been too high for everybody. And again, African Americans are kind of canaries in the coal mine. They're pointing to a problem in our society. And this relates to the point that I think Larry and Paul both made, which is that we've got to think, we've got to understand that there's economic injustice, there's racial injustice. There are both of them. Of course, that means that if you're black and poor, you're doubly impacted by these two phenomena. But if we want a just society, we've got to do something about both of them. And we should distinguish between the dimensions of injustice that are fundamentally about race and the dimensions of injustice that are fundamentally about inequality and poverty. Since I'm a philosopher, I worry a lot about distinctions. And one of the things that I think is most important to worry about is the fact that the real problem, I don't think, in the economy isn't inequality, it's poverty. I don't mind Bill Gates being rich. What I worry about is a huge number of Americans who are ridiculously poor in a rich country, who don't have access to healthcare, who are being asked, if the bill proposed by the Senate goes through, they're being asked to live on $200 a week for the next period if they are unemployed as a result of the pandemic. This is absurd in a rich country that so many people live in poverty. And the fact that it's worse for black people, which it is, shouldn't distract us, as you both said, from the fact that it's very bad overall. We are living in societies that have many forms of injustice. We could talk about gender and the continuing forms of gender injustice as well. So against that background, I think, let me just say something about, something hopeful, I hope, which is that I do feel, and I've been in many conversations. Yesterday, I'm on the board of the New York Public Library, so we had a board meeting yesterday. I'm on the board of the American Cadbury Arts and Sciences. We had a board meeting last week. And in all of these conversations, where I have to say, a very large proportion of the people involved are white, but not all, in any case, there's a real feeling that we're in a moment where we can do something about the racial injustice issues. that means that for the moment, while I continue myself to be very preoccupied with questions of class and economic injustice, I think this is a moment to focus on something, and I think it is a good moment to focus on racial justice, because I think there's a growing awareness among white people. Not just white Americans know that it's better to be white than black. If you ask white students how much money they would want to be if they were told they had to live a black life, typically they mention a figure around about $1 million. So they know perfectly well that it's better to be white than black. But they don't think of it as, very often they don't think of it as something that they should or can do anything about. I think there's a recognition that that's the wrong attitude, that you can do something about it. And I've spoken too long, but let me give one example of something that I think people are now feeling empowered to do. I think a lot of white Americans now are feeling empowered when they see racial injustice, not to think that's nothing to do with me, but to call it out. Simple things like, I'm sorry, but she was here first, said by a white person when a black person who was waiting is not being served. I think there's more of that going on. And these small things, we need lots of legal change. We need, obviously, police reform. It's ridiculous to have a country where 1,000 people are shot a year and by police, and also, by the way, scores of policemen are shot a year, and that's ridiculous too. We shouldn't have a country where that's going on. So there are lots of things, but I think these signs of real engagement of people thinking, what can I do? And finally, I do think there's a recognition now that it's important to make a distinction between taking responsibility and feeling guilty. Taking responsibility is not about guilt. No living person enslaved in the United Kingdom enslaved anybody. I mean, there are continuing problems of slavery around the world, and I suppose there are a few people in Britain who are connected with those, but I'm talking about the black slavery. That nobody did that because it stopped because the slave trade was abolished, and then slavery was abolished in the British colonies in the mid-19th century. So you don't need to feel guilty unless you've done something specifically yourself. But it is your country, your society, and you are responsible. That's what it is to live in a democracy. We are collectively responsible for what happens. And so I think it's important not to make people feel guilty. I don't think shame is inappropriate, because shame is something you can feel for things that you're not guilty of. Unfortunately, I have slave traders in the past on both sides of my family. My Ghanaian ancestors sold people into the slave trade, and some of my British ancestors owned shipping lines that shipped slaves. So, and I'm ashamed of that. I'm not guilty. It wasn't me. I didn't do it. But though I'm proud of many things my family has done, I'm also ashamed of some of them. And I think that shame is an appropriate response. And when you see, I think what many Americans, for example, felt when they saw the film of what happened to George Floyd was a sense of shame. How could this happen in my country? And shame, I think, it can be appropriate and a powerful motivating force. But I think guilt is not a good idea. Sorry, I've spoken too long.
No, you haven't. You haven't at all. That's awesomely good. We are really, really grateful, Anthony. Thank you so very much.
Sorry, I went on.
I'm fascinated by your philosophy of cosmopolitanism. And we're going to get Dhouha, I should say. Dhouha Djerbi is with us. And Dhouha is originally from Tunisia. Michael Macy is an honorary Tunisian. But no more. She's now living she actually, at this very moment, she's speaking to us from Germany, just to confuse the issue, but has led most of her recent life in France. And Dhouha is going to talk to us. Dhouha, do come in. We're honored and privileged to have you with us about talking about Black Lives Matter in the French context. And it'll be interesting to hear a little about the Tunisian context too. But let's start with the French. Dhouha, thank you for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the lovely and warm welcome. So yeah, I'll just jump straight to it. I think what I was talking about in the other rooms, that what frustrates me the most about conversations about Black Lives Matter also can what frustrates me the most about conversations about Black Lives Matter in France, and these are conversations, they're real conversations that I've had with friends and acquaintances and colleagues, is that they always, or not they, but a lot of people use this tired crutch, this tired argument that comparing Black Lives Matter in the United States and the situation in France is unjust and unfair to France, because there's this idea that like American police is much more brutal and more cruel. But I find that to be a complete myth, to be frank with you, as someone who has lived in Paris for quite some time and has seen firsthand the brutalization of Black and brown bodies by French police. And what I like to do to kind of debunk this myth is to use the example of or like the comparison between Adama and George Floyd's death. And interestingly enough, they happened a couple of weeks within one another. And Adama, who was a Black French man, he is half French, half Malian, and he was also choked by the police, and he died under the chokehold of a police officer in a Parisian suburb. And remarkably, there was a lot of cover-ups. There were several autopsies conducted, and to no one's surprise, most of them were inconclusive, which led people to speculate. But then it's so interesting seeing the medical examiners who were accused of being potential collaborators trying to justify his death by using the fact that he had a very negligible amount of marijuana in his body, which is very interesting because that is an argument that comes up quite a lot, actually, when discussing the death of Black men in particular in the U.S., of how they're delinquents, how they're drug users, and whatnot. So it's really interesting to see that parallel of using drug use as some sort of justification for the loss of a human life, as well as trying to dismiss cries about systemic injustice and systemic racism in France as just, oh, this is one man dying and this is just anecdotal evidence, which really isn't. If we look at the history of France and police brutality, this happens quite a lot, actually, and this isn't an isolated incident, and we need to see it within its context of France being a violent country with a violent police system. Now, I also wanted to highlight the fact that what's very interesting about the most of the people that die under the hands of the police extrajudicially is that most of them are tend to have immigrant backgrounds. They're mostly North African or Sub-Saharan African, and of course they occupy the low socioeconomic spheres in French society. So it's very important that we keep in mind that the brutalization and the death of Black and brown people in France happens at a very specific intersection of race and class, as well as ethnicity. And I will just stop now and hear some comments or questions. So I'll just unmute myself.
Thank you, Dhouha. And I should say, actually, you were brought up in your youth in Tunisia. It just might be interesting to hear for us. I mean, Michael Macy's here, although his screen is darkened at the moment, but presumably he's still hearing us safe and sound. There's Michael. Michael spent some time working in Tunisia recently, and I often travel there. And we're very much based in the Middle East. Is there a similar problem in Tunisia? I mean, just to...
Yeah, absolutely. Anti-Blackness is very pervasive in Tunisia and most of North Africa, actually, to the point that the word for a Black person in Tunisian Arabic is kahloush, which is a racial slur, as well as abd, which is also a racial slur and which translates to slave, actually. And for generations, people have been using these terms completely unchallenged. But quite very recently, there's been a wave of young Tunisians as well as Black Tunisians trying to push for usage of different terms to refer to Black people. And now we're kind of seeing a shift in narrative, but it is a very slow process because Tunisians are generally speaking, are under the impression that we live in a perfectly homogeneous society, ethnicity-wise, which is why it's very shocking for some to think about a Black Tunisian person. There's always that aura of foreignness about Black Tunisians that is quite violent, actually. And it's very upsetting seeing this process move this slowly. But I'm very happy that there's been a lot of work being done, particularly by Black Tunisian activists on the ground. Tunisia has recently passed an anti-racism law, which is the first in the Middle East and the Arab world in general. And it specifically caters towards Black Tunisians. But of course, now the revolution has to happen in people's mindset. Actually, having a law on paper oftentimes doesn't change much. Of course, now Black Tunisians have a legal leg to stand on, and they can claim their legal rights and protect themselves from harassment. But it is still an issue. It's still just an issue that's been unfortunately banalized and normalized quite a lot. So yeah.
Thank you. Mace is just out of curiosity. It seems unfair to pick on you, but Libya is, I presume, because of migration partly, there is a lot of prejudice against the Black community in Libya. But would that be the case?
Actually, I haven't heard before about any movement against Black people. I don't know, but I don't know if I'm delusional, but I think we all live life in harmony together. Maybe, yeah, sometimes we use like a wrong terminology to describe Black people, but it's not like we discriminate between the white and the Black, or the white get more opportunities than the Black people, or like we have more Black people in jail or something. I don't think that we have that problem.
Okay. Thanks, Mace. Michael, you
Well, I'm certainly going to concede to Dhouha any comments on Tunisia. I mean, she's right. I mean, as someone who lived there for 3 years, it's the prejudice based on melatonin is pretty obvious. I mean, and while I was there certainly were demonstrations against the institutional and societal racism. For example, and Dhouha, correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory serves me well, the traditional music that comes from the southern part of Tunisia, which certainly has roots in sub-Saharan Africa, was actually outlawed by the government under Ben Ali and their musicians in prison. So it was seen as primitive. So there are deep institutional and societal racial perspectives in Tunisia, at least the ones that Lisa was obvious to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to say as well, I mean, we lived in Oman for 6 years, and I would often call up my Arab friends because they would universally refer to anybody from Black or Asian background working in the country as Rafiq. And I'd say, no, don't do that. And they would say, but it means friend. And I said, yeah, but why do you only use it for people from India and so on, ethnic minorities, you shouldn't have a specific word for. And I think that maybe I'm wrong, but anyway, that used to bother me. But we do have a lot of unconscious prejudice around, I think. Ada, we're just talking. You missed the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, what problem with the net?
Okay, bless you. Dhouha is talking to us. Dhouha's from originally from Tunisia, but now living in France.
Yeah, I heard her. I was actually during the discussion. You said something interesting about the subconscious, but when the subconscious is politicized, either way, using in against one particular group, as happened in Germany in the 1930s, or it could go the other way around, where political correctness becoming a censorship now, where the police, while they are accused of brutality, not sort of looking after old ladies being mugged on their way from the post office, but they have a lot of energy and time to censor Twitter because of political correctness. And you mentioned something interesting about sort of Oman. I mean, with my own experience in Alexandria, when suddenly you're uprooted from your place of birth, when there's an ethnic cleansing of 200,000 Alexandrians, most of them were born and third generation, because of allegedly the military regime of after 1952 coup to right historic wrongs. Because when they used to call us Hawagat, foreigners, although I was more Egyptian than any of them culturally. And so to do that right of what they call 200 years of wrong and colonialism and so on, you get sort of stripped of your nationality, you're thrown out, you got your property sequestrated and so on. That's what's actually the background of my mind. When, okay, there's been centuries of injustice and you can never, ever, how you can actually do justice to people who have been enslaved for 200 years until the Slavery Act came into power. But we are here now. How can you address that without, in fact, making not exactly an armed civil war, but a cultural civil war, a cultural revolution like Mao Zedong? And that's what I'm actually very, very concerned about. You know, is it? It certainly is up to the individual and to certain circumstances whether they actually assimilated or integrated. If multiculturalism is going to lead into economic and cultural ghettos that would actually can breed prejudice and can breed extremism by preachers and so on. So we have to actually
it's a good point. No, that's a very, very good point. Let's bring Dhouha in because we're going to lose her.
I want to move forward from the past. What can we do now?
Yeah, absolutely. Dhouha, there's a very good sort of underlying point in what Adel was saying. It's one we haven't touched on, but France has a policy of integrationalism run riot. So you have to be French. And where's Dhouha? Have we lost Dhouha? We have.
There's been a problem with the internet. You see, in the
I've lost Dhouha, and I was talking to her. Mr. Munson is here.
Yeah.
They've switched us round, and that's very, very good. They switched us round.
I switched in mid-sentence.
Yeah. Well, we're honoured to have you, sir. Thank you so much, and thank you. It's the middle of the. Well, I can see the dawn shining through your window, so that's
just beginning. Yes.
Wonderful. Bless your heart for getting up so early.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much. We were actually just on midway through a sentence about multiculturalism versus integrationalism. But yes, America always tried the integrationalist approach, but I'm not sure it's worked very well. But I must be quiet and listen to you. Mr. Munson, please share any thoughts you have. Yeah.
All right. Well, good morning. Of course, I'm honored to be here with you today, and thank you for the invitation to speak regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. At the outset, though, I should make clear that I don't represent Black Lives Matter. I don't represent any police or governmental agency. I speak only for myself this morning. And perhaps I should relay a brief background to give you a sense of my perspective, where I come from, and how it informs what I have to say today. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the late 1960s and early 70s, a city in the USA of at the time, about 700,000 people, largely white city, about 70%, I believe, at the time as I was growing up, which is very different today, but which has been very segregated, which continues to today. As an African American with a nearly all-white police force, with the police chief appointed for life to police the community. And certainly I was very well aware and understood and was, to put quite frankly, afraid of police officers and policing. So that's part of what informs my perspective. And I'm also informed by my professional work. When I left law school in the late 1980s, my first work was as a prosecutor, working with the police department and the law enforcement community, of course, with the intention, with the hope, with the drive to help address crime, reduce crime, especially violent crime in my community. Later on, I led what is called the Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission, which is the local government entity that's charged with recruiting new police officers, hiring those officers, hearing citizen complaints, disciplining and terminating police officers if need be. So that also, of course, informs the perspective I have today. And with that, I really want to focus on two topics, which I hope facilitate some discussion. The first is why now? What is it that led the Black Lives Matter movement to become such an national and international phenomenon? Why today, as opposed to 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago? You know, one of the most inspiring, in my mind, and incredible things about this movement is its breadth and how it has grown and the vitality it's shown in such a short time. Most people are aware that the killings of Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012 and Michael Brown in Missouri in 2014 are widely seen as the catalyst for really a new generation of activists and advocates to build a framework to address racism in policing, police violence, but also more general racism in our society in the United States. Now, we of course know that did not lead to those happenstances, those circumstances, those activities did not lead to an immediate explosion of support for Black Lives Matter that we see today. Now, today, I think many have seen that the estimates in the U.S. are that between 15 and 25 million people have participated in some way in Black Lives Matter protests or activities in weeks or a few months' time. Those estimates, by the way, are by the Kaiser Family Foundation and the Pew Charitable Trust. Even if those numbers are wildly exaggerated, there's no doubt that this is, if not the largest, one of the largest social justice movements in the United States history. So again, that question is what happened and why now? So I'd like just to suggest a few reasons of why we're seeing what we're seeing now in this country, the United States. I think first, the original organizers and those who were inspired to organize and to work and to advocate, they continued that work after those killings in the early 2010s, despite the fact that they were not seeing an explosion in nationwide support, despite the fact that they were being attacked as un-American and their motives were questioned. They were actually accused of being racist themselves and supporting violence. They continued to do the work, but also to organize and provide the guidance and provide the framework for people across the country to build their own homegrown activities, protests, that helped to lay the groundwork. Secondly, I think our national administration, our government, our president and our administration has relentlessly pursued politics and expressed arguably racist, sexist, anti-LGBTQ statements that has mobilized and laid the groundwork for resistance, for outrage, for organization. And, it's very clear. There's, in this country, very different views about that. There are some people who believe that the policies of the current administration, the statements, there's nothing racist, nothing sexist about those. So I want to be very clear. I'm not saying the rightness or wrongness of that point of view. What I'm saying is that there are a lot of people who believe, who are convinced that this administration has done those things, has said those things. So in terms of defunding the police, in my mind, a long-term, well thought out discussion and reallocation should be an issue for a robust community conversation. So those are the topics I wanted to address. I guess, in my mind, in conclusion, one of the things that I find most inspiring about the Black Lives Matter movement is the scope, the fact that we can talk about or focus on very specific things like policing, what policing should be, how it should be funded. But we can also address the sort of larger societal issue of what does it mean? How can we be aspirational to make society more fair, less racist? And we can work on that not just in law, in specific policies, but also in a more general societal sense. The question is, are we at a social tipping point where the general attitudes around race and fairness and justice can be affected by movements such as this? I know that one of the quotes, one of the things that Martin Luther King would always quote during his lifetime was the famous quote of the arc of moral history being long but bending toward justice. I certainly believe that, but I think most people understand that's not about historical determinism. It's about actual human beings acting and persevering and moving toward a better and a more just world. I think Black Lives Matter movement fits into that idea, into that belief that we have to work and push and continue to see the change that we seek in the world. With that, those comments I'm open to and hope we can have a further discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much indeed. Just come in.
Interesting. Can I just say one thing? That yes, well, wonderful. Thank you so much for all your talk. But what about the younger generation? Because, okay, are they able to carry this on? The younger generation. It worries me about the younger generation not being able to carry on your work.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of friends in Georgia who are young, and they're black and white. They're actually two, a black girl and a white girl, who are from a poor end of Georgia in the backwoods, and both of them are quite frightened, which surprised me. More frightened by what's going on in their society, the tensions that they haven't seen. But that's a dynamic. But before you answer that, maybe some other voice might like to come in.
I ask Kenneth a question about America.
Yeah.
Looking back, because I was a young journalist in the 1960s, and I remember the civil rights movement. It was totally peaceful and violent, but most important, it had specific aims, specific strategy, which is civil rights, equality, etc. I don't see the Black Lives Matter as a movement have well-defined aim, and certainly there's a lot of violence and side issues that's actually making it non-focused. Can you enlighten me a bit on that one?
Okay, Ken, do comment on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes we look back in history and we, if not misremember, we don't fully remember what that history is. And certainly, if you think about what we call the civil rights movement, which we talk about in the 1960s, but of course has a longer history going back to the 50s and 40s and beyond, that movement was seen and was argued and was called violent by many people. And in many circumstances, that violence was the violence perpetrated upon those who were protesting. So, for example, in America, in the 1950s, late and certainly into the 60s, many of the aims were to eliminate legal segregation. So laws that would say, for example, as my mother experienced, you had to ride in the back of the, my parents are from Mississippi, the south of the United States. You had to, as an African American, ride in the back of the bus. Of course, when my parents were younger, you could not vote. You could not sit at a lunch counter. What often happened is when those African Americans tried to assert those rights, to go against those laws, I don't know if I'm going to be moved out of here, the violence was actually perpetrated upon them, but they were accused of starting violence. So I think, part of the issues of violence and the belief that there was not violence in the civil rights era, and there is in protests now, is in some ways a misremembering of the history of the civil rights movement. Secondly, I think you can argue that the civil rights movement of the 60s was very similar to Black Lives Movement today, in that there were very specific intentions, that is, to end legal segregation, but there was a more general focus as well. You would see the protest signs, and the signs would say, I am a man, I want equality. That's a very general, in some ways very amorphous intention. Those things fit together. I think Black Lives Matter is the same way. Yeah, I do think that in the United States, there is, at a core of the Black Lives Matter movement, some very clear aims that are aimed specifically at changing policing. They have to do with things like who is on the police force, how they behave, what are the use of force policies. So at that core, there is that specificity. Of course, any movement, as you're well aware, as it grows and spreads, it starts to inhabit so much more. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of the people in the United States who are supporting the Black Lives Movement, many of them are there for those specific aims, but others are there in reaction to a more generalized, society is not working, it is wrong, we believe things are unfair, we want to stand up for that. So I certainly, not knowing the specifics of how things are in the UK regarding this, both of those things are true. That there's a core intention, aim, goal in the U.S. There's also more generalized, things are bad, things are wrong, things should be better. I believe there is that is a character of the movement here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, so I think there are these very focused demands about policing, in part because Black Lives Matter grew out of specific episodes of police brutality. I mean, the current round is George Floyd, but Black Lives Matter has been doing this for a number of years now, and it began a while ago. So that's one thing. But I think there's another thing going on, which is, in a way, it's good that it's not too specific, which is people reflecting on the ways in which almost every aspect of life is shaped by race in ways that systematically disadvantage people of color, and especially Black people in the United States. And the data here is completely straightforward. I mean, you can do it over and over again. You do. Labor economists look at discrimination in the labor market. There's persistent anti-Black discrimination in the labor market. Labor economists can look at health disparities. Economists can look at health economists look at health disparities. Again, there's systematic health disparities. Also, there's plenty of psychological evidence. If you give people implicit attitude tests, which are relatively easy, you You can do them yourself on the web. It turns out that a lot of people have unconscious bias against black people. People who think of themselves as non-racist can have bias against black people. And I think what's going on is that a lot of people are thinking about these things and thinking it's not clear what to do about them. Unconscious bias is really hard to figure out what to do. And in fact, you probably can't get rid of unconscious bias. This is back to the point Larry's point about 30 years. In the end, that's going to depend upon raising a generation that doesn't have these biases, because unfortunately they get baked into you, and it's really, really hard. But what you can do is recognize your biases and step back from acting on them. So if you train, untrained police officers are more likely to shoot a black person who they think has a weapon than a white person. If you train them, that doesn't happen. It's not because of a change in their unconscious attitudes, because a change in the training can lead people to. So there are very specific things you can do to deal with things like implicit bias. And there are very specific things you can do about discrimination in the labour market if you want to do it. You can make changes. Again, very simple example of something. This isn't something that's generalizable, but one reason why there are more black people in symphony orchestras in the United States today is because they started doing blind auditions. They put the players behind curtains, and suddenly all these white male orchestras had women and blacks in them. And it wasn't because the people making the choices were explicitly racist. It wasn't that they were trying to exclude women and black. It's just that they had these unconscious attitudes. When they focused on the relevant thing, which was what it sounded like, turned out they got more. They got a more diverse workforce. So now that's not generalizable, because in most jobs it isn't something very, very specific like what you sound like. That's the only thing that matters. But my point is that there are things you can do once you recognize that once you recognize these problems. And I just have the feeling that I'm sort of moderately hopeful. I'm an optimistic guy, so I'm hopeful all the time. But I'm moderately hopeful because of so many conversations I've had in the last 6 months with all kinds of people. I'm on a lot of not-for-profit boards, and everything from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and New York Public Library to the American Public Theatre. In all of these contexts, where, of course, the boards are majority white, the people are saying, we must look at our practices. We must see why it is that our society produces these disparate numbers particularly for black outcomes. And, I feel there's a real willingness to think about this, not in the spirit of guilt, but in the spirit of responsibility, in the spirit of saying, it's our society, it has these features. If we do the right things, we can change them. And I think that's good. I'll say part of the reason people are excited is that we're all under, we're all in quarantine, or we're all locked away. So we're not able to do a lot of the other things that normally distract us. That's one reason. And another reason is there's a moral vacuum at the center of American politics, because the presidency is occupied by someone who simply doesn't see these problems, doesn't understand them, and in fact is contributing to exacerbating racial antipathy. And so I think that sense that we've got this moral vacuum, we're also all focused because we're all shut away. And then, a couple of episodes occurred, and people felt, this is our society, we should do something. And the good thing is that it's not as if it's news to black people that these things have been going on, but the good thing, I think, is that large numbers of white people now, especially young ones, really feel that they want to do something. They want to be, I'll just give you another, sorry, talking too long, but the graduate students in my philosophy department at NYU have summoned us, the faculty, to talk about racial inequality in American philosophy. And they are, we have one black student, but, one. but so they're mostly not black, but they want to do something. And they want to do something in their field. I think that's good.
That's powerfully said. We're going to turn to you for some final words in a moment. But does anybody else want to come in before we sort of move towards the conclusion of our discussion? Because now is the time. Any
say something?
Please do, Oliver.
I was reflecting on sort of the outpouring, especially among young white Americans like myself, and I was struck by you mentioning sort of the vacuum at the top of national government in the form of our president. It actually reminded me of the Women's March just immediately after his inauguration or after his election victory. There was this massive outpouring, one of the largest political marches in the country's history on DC. And a lot of the participants were people who had never, I would hazard a guess, including myself, had never really involved themselves with the women's cause. But it was a sort of expression of this very, very deeply felt frustration with American politics and with the result of the election and with the fate of the country at that point for the next 4 years. At this point in time, I think part of it is a reflection on the past 4 years. We've for a lot of my friends, of my younger friends, there's been 4 years of no progress, of no. There's a feeling that under President Trump, the initiatives, the social initiatives regarding race, regarding gender rights, regarding social causes, there's a frustration that these needles haven't been pushed forward. I think that's all part of the reason as well. And I think you mentioned it as well, because there's nothing else to distract sort of everyone else at the moment. You know, everyone's attention is so clearly undivided due to everyone being forced to just sort of sit and sort of think in their homes, and there's no going back to work tomorrow and forgetting about the protests or the killing. There's no seeing your friends and forgetting about the video of a black man suffocating that you've seen. You're sort of just forced to come to terms with it. I think that's also why a lot of people my age have been going to the streets.
Let me add that I think Anthony said earlier he's a moderately optimistic person. I consider myself a moderately pessimistic person, but I draw the same conclusions he does. I really do think that we're talking about a social tipping point, certainly in the United States, based upon a change recognition, almost a lifting of the veil of seeing things that maybe weren't seen before. And whether in the civil rights era, it was seeing the attacks on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or whether it was seeing people attack freedom riding in the South. I think that the police violence has been that kind of tipping point recognition that, as Oliver says, taps into that specific issue, but also taps into larger issues and dissatisfactions with the current administration in our country, with what is seen as the society moving in the wrong direction. So those things, to me, do, even though I'm moderately pessimistic, give me hope about the future, that we are at a time of changed recognition, again, a tipping point. I've got daughters who are probably the age of Oliver, maybe a little younger, in their mid-20s, and I certainly see in her generation, I think, a recognition, whether it's her or her white friends, a different kind of recognition of the world we live in, the country we live in, that maybe wasn't seen in the last generation. So from a moderately pessimistic person, I have some great hope in that.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Paul wants to come in, and then we'll go to Anthony for our conclusion. But Paul.
Yeah, I'll keep this snappy because I really want to hear from Anthony. I just listened to the conversation. I'm very much minded of William Wilberforce and the fact, of course, he's known for the main thing, the abolition of slavery, but also the second bit that he kind of like is a connection, but didn't really happen, I suggest, is the fact he also wanted to see a in his old English language, a reformation of manners in public life. And I think the connection between the abolition of slavery and also a society that lives by some moral and standard, a code, is an interesting connection. And I wonder if the old-fashioned language of morality and standards actually is coming back into vogue, because in a moral vacuum, we need morals.
Excellent. Thank you. Well said, Paul. And I am reminded when you say that we're busy pulling down statues, and yet the only statue of William Wilberforce is in his hometown of Hull. We could do one outside in central London. Let's put one up for a change. I mean, there's a man who deserves one. My heritage is Cornish, and curiously enough, there's a guy called Maynard Smith, I think his name was, but who went up and down burning slave ships up and down the South American coast. Nobody's put a statue up to him in Cornwall. There are some heroes we should put statues up to, I think. But anyway, that aside, yes. And I'm looking forward to Anthony's final words. I would love to. I've often thought there is an issue about integrationalism rather than against multiculturalism, because we've had Tony Blair brought us the kind of schooling, the faith schools, which you would think were very good. But I remember when I went to comprehensive school in the UK, I was at school with children from many different backgrounds. I wonder whether there's less integrationalism in that sense in the UK, whether that's a step forward, a step backward, now that we have more faith schools. And I would love to hear you have your philosophy of cosmopolitanism, Anthony. I'd love to hear what this means, and maybe you can put me straight and teach me the way forward. But Anthony.
Good. So, well, let me respond to, I mean, can I just say just about the general conversation that thank you all very much, and I'm very pleased to have been invited to participate and to being able to hear some of what you have to say. I wish I had time to hear more from more people. I would just like, let me just, I'll get to cosmopolitanism in just a sec, but let me just say one thing about how I think about what happened to George Floyd, because I think it's important to interpret it in a way that gets what I think are the key issues right. Of course, the first thing is, it's terrible that a human being was unjustly killed. And that's something that affects the people of Minneapolis, the people of Minnesota, and the people of the United States, because that unjust killing was done by an agent of the state. It was done by somebody who, therefore, in some sense, represents all of us. And we have a responsibility as citizens for making sure that our laws and our politicians reshape our policing in all the ways it needs reshaping, so that something like that doesn't happen again. But if you think of this simply as a matter of the death of a man, you're missing something very important, which is that this was the death of a man by someone who explicitly set out to humiliate the man he was killing. He was looking into the eyes of the young woman who was filming him, and the message was, I can do this, you cannot stop me. And it was a display of a kind of domination, which was meant to send a message. The police officer didn't, of course, mean to kill Mr. Floyd. And though he did something that, he's culpable for the death, because if you behave with reckless disregard for someone's welfare and they die, that's murder. But the real lesson, the thing that it was emblematic of, wasn't just the fact that a couple of hundred black people, between 200 and 300 black people, are killed every year in the United States, out of about 1,000 people killed by the police in a typical year. It was that over and over again, the police treat black people with contempt, with disrespect. They fail to acknowledge the equal dignity of black people. Half of African Americans, when polled, say they've had a bad interaction with the police. And the number for white Americans is 3%. That I think is the big context. Lots of studies of this get done. They did a great study. Some people at Stanford did a great study in Oakland that showed the Oakland police. When the Oakland police stopped people for traffic offences, they were just ruder to black people because they had cameras, so they could record these interactions. They were just less polite to the black people they stopped for the very same offences. They were also more likely to stop them. But the point is, they were just impolite. They were discourteous. They did not display the proper respect that a democratic police owe to citizens, even citizens who they've arrested. So I think that's it wasn't just the death. It was the fact that the death was the result of this everyday, regular disrespect for black people. I think that sort of people got that. Lots and lots of people got that. African Americans say this already. They say half of them have had a bad interaction with the police, but I think that's become more widely known. Now, cosmopolitanism is relevant here because cosmopolitanism consists of, in the way I think about it, consists of two thoughts. One is a thought that is shared by all decent people, and that is the idea that there's a universal morality in the sense that everybody is entitled to be treated properly. Every human being is entitled to basic respect, that they should be treated with dignity, their rights should be respected, and we should care about what happens to them. But, every decent person thinks that. What's distinctive about the cosmopolitan is that the cosmopolitan values the fact that all those people who are all entitled to equal dignity and respect are going to be making their choices to live different kinds of lives. They'll have different religious faiths. They'll live in societies organized differently because they've chosen to organize themselves differently. They'll belong to clubs that do things that other clubs don't do. They'll have interests that other people don't have. And all modern societies are societies of people who are different in those ways, who nevertheless need to live together and to run the state together. They have shared democratic responsibility for the societies they live in. I think that cosmopolitan attitude means that you're interested, you're not just aware that people are different, you're actually interested in conversation with people who are different because you think you gain something from it. I mentioned in one of the breakout rooms that I was raised by a mother who, among other things, taught us to think of haiku, a 17th century Japanese verse form, as an important form of poetry. My life, and my mother also wrote haiku. She wrote haiku in English, but she wrote, so they're not really haiku, but 17 syllable, 3-line verses. That sense that you can gain from conversation with people who are not like you is at the heart of cosmopolitanism. Now, I don't believe that everybody is up for that. There are people who, for one reason or another, want to live lives closed off from difference. If you want to live a life as a monastic on the Greek mountain, you're going to be living among other monastics on the Greek mountain, and you won't meet any women if you're a man. You won't meet any women, and you won't meet any people who aren't monastics. Okay, that's a form of life. In Pennsylvania, not 50 miles from where I live now, where I am now, there are communities of Amish who don't want to meet the people around them. They want to live in their own communities. They're Mennonites. They have a very set of religious disciplines, and they live in those communities. That's their right. And similarly, there are Orthodox communities, Jewish communities, for example, in New York City, that also want to close themselves off. But we need. So I'm not saying everybody has to do this, but unless a lot of us do it, we won't be able to solve the problem of living together in multi-religious, multi-racial societies, multi-identity societies. And one of the problems, and William mentioned the fact that one of the great things about successful state schooling in a civilized society is that it brings people of all the kinds in the society together as young people to do things together so they know about each other. If it works right, they meet on terms of rough equality, they study things together, they play soccer together or basketball, or they're in bands or orchestras together, they do plays together. And that regular interaction with people of other identities has a profound psychological effect because it makes it harder for you to be bigoted. I mean, the name for this is in psychology is the contact hypothesis, but you don't need fancy names for it. And if you have a society in which people are siphoned off into all these separate sub-communities and they don't regularly interact with one another, some of them at least don't regularly interact with one another and get to know each other's things. Christians go to bar mitzvahs or to share meals at Eid with their Muslim friends or go to Seders with their Jewish friends. If you don't do that, it's harder when somebody makes a generic remark about people of some kind. It's harder to hold back from going along with the prejudice. If you do that, then when people say things about Jews, you think, wait a minute, my friend Henry is Jewish, and what you just said about him is not true about him. People make generalizations about Muslims. If you have Muslims, I have the privilege of having Muslim cousins. I grew up with Muslims. So when a lot of what people say about Muslims, I know it's not true, at least about my cousins. So I think actually, I'm not a big fan of the decision the British decision to create schools, religiously based schools, especially if they're funded by the state, because I think that I went to an Anglican school, but we had Muslim and Jewish people at school, and I think it would have been better, frankly, from an educational point of view, if we hadn't been as Anglican as we were. I have nothing against Anglicanism in particular, but I worry about being raised in a kind of, I don't mean there's anything wrong with being raised as an Anglican, but I do think there's something wrong with being raised in England and only knowing Anglicans in a society which, after all, has, and my father was a Methodist, so, there are other kinds of Christian as well as other kinds of, as well as other kinds of non-Christian people. So yeah, I think the cosmopolitan message is that the world will work better if we spend time and not time talking about our differences, though that's fine, but time being together, as it were, in spite of our differences, or with our differences not being in focus, because we're thinking about something else. We're thinking about how to be a better soccer team. We're not thinking about how to be Muslims and Jews and Christians in a soccer team. We're thinking about how to be footballers. And if you do that with people of different kinds, this is why I think regular interfaith work is actually terrific, because people, again, just to speak about my mother, she belonged to a group in our hometown which consisted of people of all the different Christian traditions and also people from the big mosques who worked together on problems to do with the old people's homes and orphans and poverty and so on. And they then went off on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays to their own churches and temples, and mosques. But they worked together, and they worked together on these projects not in order to build interfaith relations, but because they had a shared interest in making their society better.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Anthony. What powerful words. And so much to think about now. I really am grateful to you all, one and all. I'm thinking, the thing that flashes into my mind is my Auntie Sylv down in Wales, who's was hoping that at this time of COVID, and she used this phrase, we'd stop bouncing around like fleas on a tennis ball and start to love one another. Not sure we have, but my goodness, this
brings me in. Because,
go on, Veronica, yes.
Samuel was really scared, actually, because he's a quite stocky young man, but he was scared of getting knifed. You know, he's a big guy, and he was really.
Yeah,
and when he went out, he was. I think I'll go quickly round there, and he was scared of being knifed. And as I say, he's a big guy, and he could have done something about it, but. He went to all these different things, but it made me think, now, that's one person that's really scared about being knifed.
Well, there are a lot of people scared, and a lot of people, but we need to build on the kind of world that Anthony suggests we should have. That is really what we need, and I do hope and pray that we shall have it. It was very, very powerfully said, Anthony, and I'm a believer. Cosmopolitanism, I think, has to be the way forward. So you've convinced me, and thank you one and all. Special thanks to Kenneth, who came in also at the last minute, as did Anthony, actually. And indeed, all of you. Yes, Dhouha, if you're there, thank you very much. And Paul, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
And those that want to stay and chat can stay and chat. There is, but the formal time of the meeting is over. With sincere thanks to Kenneth and Anthony, thank you so very, very much. And bless your hearts, and we'll talk again. Everybody, thank you for being here. Michael, thank you for introducing Kenneth. And what we'll do is we will draw the meeting to a close and all think about things. But if you want to stay, I'm still here. But the meeting now is brought to a conclusion. Bless you and thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thanks. And a real joy. I was listening to you in the Wreath lectures, and you were so impressive. And funnily enough, I've got them all recorded, and I haven't listened to the last one yet. So we'll have to. I will now do that.
I can't remember what the last one's about. Oh, the last one is my attack on the idea of Western civilization.
Well, it probably needs a little attacking.
Not because I'm against civilization, but because I'm against the idea that you can wall civilizations off from each other. And the great thing about civilizations, I think, is that they steal across boundaries. That's the cosmopolitan thought. I mean, just to go back to Basho in the haiku, so he's a 17th century Japanese poet, but he writes in a Chinese script, because the Japanese took their script from China, and he's a Buddhist, which means he took his religion from India.
Gosh.
So that one of the greatest Japanese poets is doubly shaped by China and India.
How remarkable. How remarkable. That is something. The Rumi, the great Persian sage, was Sunni, and that always surprises me. I mean, there are so many crossovers we're not aware of. And I've got a lot of time for Rumi.
I mean, I teach a course, well, this year I'm teaching it. I taught it last time, and I'm teaching it next time. I don't normally teach it twice a year, but on global ethics. And one of the things we do is to look at Muslim traditions of ethics in the period that corresponds to the European late Middle Ages. And they're so shaped by Aristotelianism and to some extent by Plato. And equally important, the rediscovery of classical learning in the Renaissance comes in part by way of the Arab commentators on the Greek classics. When Christian classicists talk about the commentator in the early modern period, they're talking about a Muslim, and they mean he's the commentator on Aristotle. So the idea that these intellectual traditions as well are, that they flourish because they borrow and steal across boundaries. If we think about the ways in which Christianity draws on both traditions out of the Middle East, but also, of course, very much on Stoic philosophical ideas. St. Paul's cosmopolitanism is basically Stoic, and because the Roman Empire, the intellectual life of the Roman Empire was very much shaped by Stoicism. One of my father's favorite books was Marcus Aurelius' Meditations.
All right. Yeah.
My father was a very, very devout Christian, and Marcus Aurelius, among other things, as emperor, persecuted Christian But he wasn't a Christian. But if you read about how his sense of how we are all children of one God and so on, you can't but feel that he's already got the basic Christian idea, even though he's not very keen on the organized church because he thought it was a problem for the empire. Mm. So I think if you try to eradicate either the Semitic or the Roman Greek elements of Christianity, you wouldn't have, it would disappear.
Yeah.
You'd be dissolving the roots out of which it comes. So
Daniel Barenboim has this wonderful orchestra which brings in all people from all sides of the
he does indeed.
And it's really, really, because they're bringing together all different sects.
Palestinians and Israelis. Yeah, yes,
so
musicians in
exciting.
One orchestra. Yes, that's beautiful too.
It reminded me of something I'd read from Kenneth Munson. He wrote a sort of a liberal attack on multiculturalism, sort of talking about how it overemphasizes difference and the dangers that then you sort of forget about the common shared traits that do bind humans together. And I was just reminded of that as you were speaking about cosmopolitanism towards the end.
Yes. No, and I think the point is that we everybody is both different from everybody else and also shares something with anybody. You put two human beings together, they're going to find something. But it'll be a different thing for any two. So our common humanities in part consist in the fact that we can find ways of joining with other people, but different ways for different people because the people are different. Mm. There isn't one route into interaction, into humane interactions with other people. There are many. All around the world, I can settle down with people and talk to them about philosophy. And some of them are from Cameroon, and some of them are from Australia, and some of them are from Ecuador. But there's this thing we have in common. Anglicans can go to many, many countries and recognize the forms of service and participate because they know the hymns and they know at which point you're supposed to say, the Kyrie and so on. So, and the same is true, of course, for Catholics and Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims and so on. There are these massive ways of connecting with people across all kinds of difference. One of the things that Malcolm X, that sort of revolutionized the intellectual life of Malcolm X was going to Mecca and being, for the first time in his experience, in a place where it didn't matter what color you were. And W.B. Du Bois is one of my heroes, a great African-American intellectual of the late 19th, he lived until 1960, but he was born in the late 1970s. He writes very movingly in a couple of his autobiographies about having grown up as a black person in the United States. And when he arrived in Germany to go to the University of Berlin after he finished at Harvard, he said he was grateful for Germany because it was the only place he'd ever been where he was responded to, first of all, not as a black person, but as a student, as a member of the Germans called the Bildungsbürgertum, the educated middle classes. And it was very good for him because then he went back to America and he said, I can imagine now interacting with white people as people. Because I've been in a place where people reacted to me as a person, not first of all as a black person. And and that of course was possible because he had a very, very sophisticated education, and so he could talk to people in Berlin in terms that other educated people in terms that they recognized and understood. And he was astonished. He actually spent a bit of time on the way to the University of Berlin. He got there early. I've forgotten the name of the town. It's the town where Luther translated the Bible. And he stayed with a German family, with a German father, a priest. And he just couldn't get around the fact that the daughter thought it was okay to flirt with him. He just thought, that where he came from, white girls it wouldn't have occurred to them to flirt with a black man. And, she actually fell in love with him. And it just blew his mind. So anyway, connections. She was a young German middle-class woman. He was an African-American, highly educated. She was not so highly educated. But they were able to make a link with one another.
You're right. Well, you're right. I've been hugely impressed by Arab philosophy. I was introduced to it by some Alawite, an aging Alawite, who referred to God as the great unknown, which is a kind of Alawite way of regarding God. But and now more recently, it's been broadened out by a Sufi friend of mine, Safavi, and he's introduced me to a guy called Mullah Sadr. And I found it very reassuring because I was getting very angry with God. I mean, being not everybody's a believer, but I'm a believer, and I get quite angry with all the sort of nature red in tooth and claw and the rape of the universe with COVID and viruses and volcanoes and goodness knows what. And I think it's all so unfair and the injustice of it all. And this guy got me reading Mullah Sadr, and Mullah Sadr has it that, whoa, wait a minute, you're not unique. Humanity is not unique. God had to give free will to all of creation and take his hand away from all of creation. Otherwise, you're going to be walking around in some Garden of Eden where everything is completely false and unrealistic. So in order to make humanity grow and allow humanity to grow, God had to take his hand away from everything, says Mullah Sadr, from the virus to the volcano and humanity, and give it all free will. And then there's hope and there's a future. And that made me, that was actually hugely reassuring. And that was from an Arab philosopher who is quite a remarkable guy. But anyway, quite remarkable because he was talking about the theory of evolution centuries and centuries before Darwin. He was laying it all out. So some of these ideas are remarkable. Anyway, sorry, that's an aside from me.
No. I do think that, for me, one of the great contributions of the Muslim philosophers to ethics is something that it derives from the idea in the Quran that Muslims are responsible for commanding right and forbidding wrong. But it's the idea that which I think a lot of modern people just don't have in the country that I live in, which is that we are, in a certain sense, responsible for trying to help other people in our community live better lives. That it's not, of course, each of us is responsible for our own life, but that doesn't mean that other people shouldn't be helping us and reminding us when we fall short. And when you see this, from that, it's a very sophisticated tradition of thought. So it takes account of the fact that if you are in a position where someone is much more powerful than you, for example, it can be risky to correct them, and so it doesn't suggest that you should, as it were, tell the caliph off if the caliph will execute you if you're rude to him. But it does say that where you can make a positive difference and where you're not putting yourself in danger, you have a duty to try and help. When you see wrong being done, you have a duty to try and help your neighbors stop doing it. And that's Americans react very badly, in my experience, against that. When people politely point out in the current situation that you really ought to be wearing a mask, people get very angry that people are not wearing a mask. But they should really be grateful that someone has drawn attention to the fact that they're doing something that's wrong, because it's wrong to endanger other people when there's a simple thing you can do to stop it. I find that. As I say, it's a very sophisticated tradition. It has many complex rules, which is one of the things we talk about in my classes. But I think there's a lot of, and the other thing we do in this class is I talk a lot about Confucian ideas. I think Confucianism also has a great set of insights into moral life, particularly about the role of relationships in shaping our moral obligations. The fact that we have special relationships which impose special obligations on us, I think, is a thought that is not very well articulated in European philosophy until really the 20th century in a clear way. But Confucius already, well, especially Mencius, so a couple of thousand years ago, already had this deep insight, and I think it's a very important one because it explains how you can both be, as I said, as a cosmopolitan, share with everybody the sense that everybody matters and that universality is important, but at the same time recognize that what I owe to particular people is different, because some of them are my children, and some of them are my friends, and some of them are my parents, and some of them are my fellow citizens. And those relationships mean that I have special responsibilities to some people, though I have, of course, responsibilities to everybody, just as a human being, but I have special responsibilities. And I think that balance between the sort of responsibilities we have to particular local connections and our global responsibilities, that's one of the great challenges of cosmopolitanism, is getting that balance right. And I find Confucianism very helpful in thinking about that.
Wow. Well, that's interesting. I hadn't heard anything of Confucianism. Well, I suppose I have. I always think of isn't the uncarved block? Is that Confucianism? Is that something else?
I don't know about that.
Oh, right. It probably comes from.
There's an awful lot of Confucians. They've been at it for 2.5 millennia, and it's a very, very rich tradition. And as in most complex philosophical traditions, you can find for anybody arguing for some proposition, you can find somebody arguing the opposite. So it's like people say that slavery was, Aristotle endorsed slavery. That's true, but it's also true that people in Aristotle's day, in his culture, criticized slavery.
Yeah.
Not everybody thought that slavery was okay, even then. I forget who it was that mentioned Wilberforce earlier, but Wilberforce is interesting to me in part because he was at the center of a couple of rather distinct moral revolutions. Obviously, abolitionism was one. He was also very, very big in the anti-dueling movement, and dueling was a sin that was. I say it's a sin because it was condemned by the church. I think the first condemnations of dueling in Christianity are in the 9th century, so it's not like it's not a new Christian thought that dueling is bad. It's a thought from the very beginning that you shouldn't. And actually, it's bad for an interesting reason. It's bad because interesting reason from a Christian point of view, because it's a form of tempting God, right? You're asking God to make sure that the just person wins. But that's just tempting God. That's like inviting Christ to throw himself off the temple so the angels can lift him up. Many other things are wrong with dueling as well, as involves trying to kill people. But anyway, he was very big in that as well. And so he was sort of on the forefront of moral change. And I think that's one of the very interesting features of evangelical Christianity in the late 18th century. It was on the forefront of moral change. In the 19th century, evangelical Christians were very important in the fight against foot binding in China, for example, where they were also on the forefront of moral change.
Yes, there's that extraordinary. There are extraordinary heroes lurking around. There's the guy who wrote this song "Amazing Grace," who was, I think, originally Irish, but he was one of the inspirations for Wilberforce. I can't even remember his name now. but he started off as a slaver. He started off as a slave ship, but he was kind of a mentor for Wilberforce. We haven't got a statue up. I don't think there's a statue to him anywhere in the world. There certainly isn't one in Britain. But there are a lot of interesting heroes we should be putting up statues to. Who are not acknowledged. But how fascinating this all is.
One thing I want to say about statues is, when people say, well, what should we do about these people? In the United States, take Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote some beautiful words about freedom. I mean, he drafted, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are powerful, beautiful words. He was also a slaveholder, and forced one of his woman slaves to have children with him. She may or may not have consented, but in the context of slavery, it's rather hard to know what consent amounts to. When people ask me, should we have statues to Thomas Jefferson or not? I think my answer is, well, we should recognize the truth about Thomas Jefferson, right? Which is both of those things. He wrote these beautiful words about freedom. He did try to get slavery abolished in Virginia before the Revolution, and he did try to get it removed from. He was against continuing the recognition of slavery under the Constitution, and was one of the people who made sure that the Constitution was designed in such a way that slavery was eventually going to go away. But he held slaves. I think, and to think about that, of course, his relationship with his slave was also adultery. Not only was it adultery, but it was second generation adultery, because the slave he had sex with was the daughter of his wife's father. He'd also had sex with a slave. She was his sister-in-law. If they'd been married, she would have been his sister-in-law. So I think we should recognize these truths, and then we should ask ourselves this question: how do we want to be thought about 200 years from now? Because we're doing things that are terrible. Maybe some of them we recognize, maybe some of them we don't. And I think we should ask to be recognized as complicated, as some of us at least trying to do good things, but all of us failing, and that this is one of the great insights of the Christian tradition, I think, the idea of original sin, the idea that all of us is imperfect. Nobody's perfect. And in the Christian context, only by grace do we get to do things to be saved. So I think, if you're only going to keep statues of people who are sort of perfect, then you're not going to have any statues. Because the guy who wrote Amazing Grace, he wrote Amazing Grace, and he was a big abolitionist. But as you say, he was also a slave captain before that. It's very hard to find someone who's right about everything. In fact, impossible. Nobody's right about everything. So we got to be, I would say, a little bit of. What we shouldn't say is that, oh well, everybody thought like that at that time, so we should excuse them. No, we don't excuse Thomas Jefferson. We criticize him, but we also admire the good things about him, I think. So with Colston, I don't know what I feel. I mean, he was a great philanthropist. On the other hand, he was also someone who made a lot of money out of slaving. But then, both of those things are true.
I'll tell you, Michael wants to come in. Before he does, I will tell you my reaction, because Michael was very forceful, and let's pull these statues down. I'll let him say what he wants to say, but I'm just going to tell you my little reaction when the Colston statue was pulled down. Oddly, and perhaps I have to examine myself, I didn't like it. And then when they slapped up a statue of a black girl with her fist in the air in place of the Colston statue, then that pleased me. Then I was happy again. And then when the council tore down the statue of the black girl with her fist in the air, then I was upset again. Now, what this is just an emotional reaction. I have no idea the rationalization of this, but I'm just telling you my emotional reaction. But Michael wants to chip in.
Yeah, I would just, again, from an American perspective, I see just because a statue exists doesn't mean we should search for the good side. I mean, I would use Nathan Bedford Forrest as an example. Here's a man who was a slave trader, revolted against the United States, was a Confederate general, supervised the massacre of prisoners who were African American, and then helped found the Ku Klux Klan. I don't really see a reason to keep his statue up just because it exists. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find any positive contribution that he made. And I would say that that's true for most of the Confederate statues in the U.S.
So I didn't mean to say I was only putting this in the context of how I think about it. That doesn't mean I'm against taking down statues or stopping calling the Woodrow Wilson School the Woodrow Wilson School. Woodrow Wilson. And one thing I'll say about Confederate statues is that they were put up. The main reason they were put up was to reinforce white supremacy. But that seems a good enough reason to take them down. Not because the people who are in them may not have had some virtues, which they probably did, but because they're there as a message of white supremacy. The Colston statue wasn't there as a message of white supremacy, but on the other hand, it was put up in the late 19th century, by which time people should have known better. They should have known that a proper reflection on Colston included the fact that he was a slave trader. I mean, I think, so that's different from a statue. In other words, if the statue had been put up when he died, that would be one thing. It would not have been put up in order to send messages about, or in ignorance of, because when he died, the abolitionist movement hadn't even started. But so I think there's a big difference between, it's not. I was thinking more about sort of how we should think about these people in terms of whether the statue should stay or go. I think when if a statue was raised in order to symbolize white supremacy, that seems like an awfully good reason to say, if we reject white supremacy, let's take it down. So I agree with that, and I agree about Forrest that there's no reason to keep statues of him up. And I would say, the president wants to keep the names of people like Bragg on military bases, but Bragg was an enemy of the United States, and Bragg's main redeeming feature was that he was a bad general, and so helped the Union armies win battles against it. So that's a redeeming feature. Maybe we should celebrate, but I'm not sure you want to have a military base that you're celebrating a general because he was ineffective in an army that fought against your country. But so I don't think Fort Bragg ought to be called Fort Bragg. But I'm just saying that I think in thinking about these things, it is important to recognise that we're all sinful, as it were, so that the right way to think about the statue is not really about the goodness or badness of the person. It's about what it means. If it means something that you don't mean, you should take it down because you don't want to send a message that you don't believe in.
Interesting. Udit wanted to ask you a question, Anthony. He sent me a little message saying he wanted to ask you a question, but Udit, we can't see you, but go ahead. You can, I'm sure, ask Anthony. Won't mind answering.
There's some issues with my camera, but I think my audio works. So I just need to ask, I know Paul Gutteridge today in the meeting described in his sort of initial speech described Black Lives Matter as a white issue. And it had me thinking about the terminology used within sort of racial discourse in the country, the whole terminology of BAME. I just wanted to know, do you think that sort of term essentially homogenizes racial minorities in the country as sort of fosters that white other divide? I just wanted to hear your perspective on that, because I know you must have some thoughts on it.
I mean, if the problem is let's call it white supremacy. If the problem is the thought that white people essentially matter more than anybody who's not white, then you need a term for the non-white people. And in England, you've settled on BAME. In the United States, I think most people would say people of color when they're talking about non-white people. So you need a category. But look, I think one of the really important things for us to think about is that neither the category white nor the category BAME is culturally homogeneous. White people are pretty different from each other too. So it's only if you think of these categories as categories of people who have the same culture that you'll make a mistake. Williams in Cornwall, there are distinctive Cornish traditions. We were talking about Birmingham earlier. Birmingham is a long way in many ways from and rural Cornwall and urban Birmingham are different. The cultures. If you're in the bottom, if you're in the precariat in the United States, if you're on the bottom 15% of the population, your chance of going to college is about 2%. Only 1 in 50 people from that part of the population goes to college. That means that that in terms of what you might call high culture, in terms of the culture of educated people, lots of people in that group are not participating in that. They have a different kind of cultural life. So as long as we don't think of these categories as categories of people of one culture, that'll be okay. I think the problem comes from thinking that, oh well, this is something called British culture, and it's white, and it consists of, and then you list a bunch of things, and then I can think of, list whatever you like. I'm going to be able to point to a lot of people who are white and British and don't do those things. So I think it's the kind of what psychologists call essentialization, the tendency to think of people in these categories as more like each other than they actually are. That's the problem. So if you don't fall into that, then having a word like an expression like BAME, whose function is just to identify the non-white people, is useful, because there is a contrast between the racial situation of white people and black people. Even though, of course, if you're in the precariat and you're white, while you do in fact have privilege vis-a-vis black people who are also in the precariat, you have many, many forms of disprivilege as well, class disprivilege and economic disprivilege, and that's one of the ways in which you're not like white people who don't suffer from class disprivilege or economic disprivilege. So I'm not too worried about this, as long as people don't essentialize these categories. Sometimes people say, oh, we should simply be black and Asian and so on, but black people aren't all homogeneous either. Black people come from the Caribbean and Africa and the United States and Britain, and some of them are Catholic and some of them are Muslim and some of them are Christian and belong to different Christian denominations, and so on. And some of them like spicy food and some don't. So I think we use these categories and they have their uses, but we tend to essentialize. We tend to think of them as more homogeneous than they actually are. So that's my thought about it. What do you think?
Thank you.
I think I'm of two minds about, actually. I think on one hand, having that category does highlight sort of the disparity in sort of the social reality for white people, and then the social reality for different ethnic minorities. But then at the same time, I think it could, and certainly not the term itself, but the way it's sort of interpreted and the way it's sort of obfuscated, that could sort of potentially marginalize some experiences. So, like, let's say the experience of a working class, as you said, the experience of a working class black man would be vastly different to a black person born to privilege, for example. So yeah, I'm myself of two minds of it, but I just wanted to hear your perspective on it, because
I think again, any identity category is going to be, any of these social identities is going to be inhomogeneous. Black working class people are also different from each other.
Yeah.
Some of them are gay and some of them are straight. Some of them are devout Methodists and some of them are devout Muslims and so on. So as long as we remember that, when we put a label on people, we're just picking one aspect of them and they'll be different in all other kinds of ways. As long as I think we bear in mind, there's no harm in these labels. The difficulty is when we, as I say, when we do what psychologists call essentializing.
Yeah.
And then I agree. It's very bad. And as you say, it's bad in particular because we end up focusing on, as it were, what we think of as the typical situation of people in the category. And that means that people whose situation in the category is atypical don't get attention.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Labels. Yeah, you make me realize, of course, I hate labels. I used to hate it in the 60s when girls would ask what star sign you were. Inevitable, the first question they would ask. They don't do it now, but, well, I don't go dating now. I've got my wife. But in those days, it was always this first question. And I would lie, or not answer. One or the other. Anyway, that, and then the other thing I got more wrinkly. I don't like being asked my age, even on the telephone by people, because I feel I immediately slotted into a box, and if I can, I will refuse, because what right have you got to do that? But they do it. They even your credit card or anything. It's the first question they ask, the ID question. And it irritates me no end. But there you go. That's me. So yes, boxes. We're all putting each other into lots of boxes all the time.
Well, I think part of the problem is that we have adapted boxes that have no meaning. Mm-hmm. Melatonin is really not a determinant of anything, and yet it's become an absolute determinant for many people's lives. And I think that's the problem. If someone asks me my faith, that may tell you something about me, at least within certain parameters. Or if someone asks me my income or my education level or my nationality in the sense of being American or in the U.S., that's a determinant of some things. Melatonin is not a determinant of anything, and yet it's become an absolute determinant. It's become a matter of life and death for a lot of people. And that's where it's, in a sense, a much more dramatic exposition on your being asked a star sign. Well, that probably has nothing to do with anything, nor does an artificial. It's totally not. I won't say it's an accident of history, but it has not always been part of the human experience. It could have been prejudiced against short people who were enslaved. That also is not height is not a determinant of anything. But this is, and I'm just making this up. I admit, I just kind of made it up at the spur of the moment. But I'd be curious to see, and I think that's it. And it's so difficult to overcome these determinatives which actually have no base, have actually determined nothing.
Well, but I mean, I sort of agree. But I think the important point is that given the way social life is organized, having a black identity does in fact shape an awful lot of what happens to you, and so there is it does in fact tell you something about people. The thought is that first of all, it doesn't. Lots of the things that people think it tells you, it doesn't tell you. That is to say, people have false beliefs about what being black signifies. And second, that to the extent that it does have significance for people, a lot of the reason for that is a lot of bad stuff, a lot of stuff that shouldn't happen. What the world would look like in terms of these categories if we could get rid of the prejudices and the structural injustices, I have no idea, because I think we're pretty far away from that. And if that were to happen, maybe it's inevitable if that were to happen that these racial categories would at least mean a lot less to people. Fewer fewer people would care about them and they would care about them less. Whether they would disappear all entirely, I don't know, because I could imagine them shifting into kind of into sort of positive categories and so on, and people feeling, well, I'm dark skinned, so I have this connection with Africa. I don't live in Africa, but I'm kind of interested in Africa in a way that is connected with this. I can imagine that going on, and that would be harmless. The worry is that right now, it's slightly different in different places. So this is a point I made in the first room, a separate room, that the situations are slightly different in different places. So in the United States, as you well know, because of the so-called one-drop rule, you don't even have to have melatonin to be black. in our weird way of accounting. So Walter White, who was the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People for much of the middle of the 20th century, had blue eyes and white skin, but he was as he said, he called himself a Negro. And, he was very useful to the NAACP because he could go into white communities and pass for a white person. And he went to investigate lynchings. But he identified as a black person, and under our weird scheme, he was in a weird way. I remember years ago, I have two African American goddaughters, and I have a nephew who's half Norwegian. And he happens to be blonde and very fair skinned. And we were having dinner, all of us, in actually Lexington, Massachusetts, Revolution. I and my nephew and my daughters and their parents. And one of my goddaughters said casually to this young man, "Well, of course, you're black." And he didn't live in the United States, and he just sort of went, "What?" Now, he's lived in Africa all his life. His father's Norwegian, but he's always lived in Southern Africa. So if you said he was an African, he'd say, "Sure, he's born in Africa, mother's African, his wife is African." But he just thought it was weird to be told that he was white. And I remember the adults looked at each other, and we thought, we're not going to help them with this. We're just going to let them talk to each other about this, and they can figure it out for themselves. But in England, I don't think there's quite the same tradition of thinking that if you have any African or non-white ancestry, you're sort of not white. And so in England, there is more of a correlation actually between how people are treated and what colour they are, what literal colour they are, not what figurative colour they are. But yeah, so I just don't know what a world would look like when we didn't have all this.
Well, it's becoming less just as people change. I mean, in the sense you're talking about I think the commonality of the human experience is much greater just because of social media. I mean, certainly the India that I first went to as a student in the 80s is much different than the India village life today because of that. And so it's kind of, in one way, it's sad we're losing some of the diversity and some of the color, but at the same time, it's becoming much more difficult to paint someone else as the other because the experience is becoming much more common. So it's that balance issue where, in many ways, there's a cost for the lessening of the tension and the prejudice. You lose some of the color, you lose some of the variety.
Yes. I mean, I think, of course, what you say is absolutely true. We are, on the other hand, a long way from all being the same. People in rural India are still, on average, not very much like people in Filkins in Gloucestershire, where my mother grew up. But yes, I think there are. I mean, you can't. A lot of the homogenization in the world, I think, is for the good. I mean, we've taken several hundred million people out of poverty. That's made them more like other people who are out of poverty. Great, wonderful. Unfortunately, the pandemic has now put 250 million people back on the risk of falling into the worst kind of poverty, and we're going to have to do something about that once we've dealt with the pandemic. But over the last, so blocking out for the moment what's happened in the last year, one of the ways in which the world has become more homogeneous is good, all right? Another way is that there's much less sexism in the world than there was everywhere. Even if there's more sexism in some places than others, women's opportunities have expanded enormously in every society, in every country, even if they're still different in different places. And I can't be against that. So yeah, even though I believe that it's good to live in a world with lots of diversity, there are kinds of diversity that I'm happy to see disappear. And I think people create new kinds of difference all the time, of course, as well. That's the other thing. There are new ways of. Interestingly, I mean, one of the things about this pandemic is that because the only way we can meet right now is this way, we can now meet in groups where it doesn't matter where you are. Now, I've had many more meetings with people in many places. I mean, I travel a fair amount and I go to conferences in many places, but now I can do that, once a week. I can get together with people. My Nigerian brother-in-law's 60th birthday, we could get together on Zoom, and my sister in Namibia and my sister in Eastbourne and me and friends from around the world and the children who are in 4 or 5 different countries. We could all be seeing each other and celebrating. And I kind of think that's another good way in which we're closer together without being physically close together.
Yeah, one of the things we've seen is after years of trying to get young Israelis and Palestinians together, we're now able to do it on Zoom, where even 8 months ago when we were attempting to do it physically, it was almost impossible.
Yes.
And so it's a small thing, but it is a different experience.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah.
Yes, and also it's one reason is that though governments could intervene, it's harder for them to stop this kind of meeting than it is to stop people crossing physical borders. So I can't go to England right now because the government rightly recognises that the pandemic's out of control in the United States. But I can talk to people in England any day of the week. I have to remember, I had to get up at 5:30 to do this, but I don't know where you are, but you probably did too. Yes.
No, actually, I'm in Greenwich, so I'm in.
Okay. Oh, you're on the Greenwich Meridian. This thing. I mean, one of the things about this technology is that I've been able to watch I have a half Russian, a quarter Norwegian, an 1/8 Ghanaian, 1/8 British great niece, and I have a half Namibian, a quarter Norwegian, an 1/8 Ghanaian, 1/8 British great nephew, and I have a 3/4 Nigerian, 1/8 British, 1/8 Ghanaian great nephew, and they live predictably in different countries. No 2 of them live in one and the same country. But I can follow their growing up.
Yeah.
And I get WhatsApp videos of them as they learn to walk and learn to speak and so on. And I know it's wonderful. Otherwise, I would be just a remote great uncle in a faraway country. Mm-hmm. I think those connections. Another way in which this technology is enormously useful, and your Israeli-Palestinian thing is an instance of it, is that it can allow people who are in circumstances where there's penalties to, there's a risk associated with identifying yourself in certain ways, to meet other people. So, in Uganda today has a very, very homophobic regime. It's really, really hard to be lesbian or gay in Uganda today. But Ugandan LGBTQ people can get together on the web with LGBTQ people outside Uganda as well as in Uganda and have a sense of community and learn about what it is to live as a dignified lesbian or gay person. That's an enormously important thing. I think this is very important in the Middle East in relation to the situation of women. The power of things like the Saudi women's movement is connected with their connection with people outside Saudi Arabia. The models that they can pick up on and the conversations they have with women, not just outside the Middle East, but women in say Abu Dhabi who are in a very different situation from women in Saudi Arabia.
That must be lovely.
Again, on average, and not varying in mind, the class makes a difference.
Oh, it really has been a remarkable conversation. Are you talking about people getting up? Katya had to get up in the middle of the night. No, she's in California. There are some
really in the middle of the night.
Yeah, she's.
Yeah, it was.
Oh gosh, yeah. What time was it when we started? You were. It must
3
have been
in the morning.
3 in the morning.
Hello.
Very little sleep for Katya. You're going to stay for the Lebanese meeting, Katya?
Yeah.
Wow, you're impressive. You're impressive indeed. Yeah. I hope you get a good sleep after it's all finished.
I went to bed at like 7 last night. It's okay.
Oh, well done.
Did you sleep though?
Yeah. I slept for a few hours.
Oh, good.